guys, it's Kira and welcome back to another vlog. Today is Saturday the 21st of September, which means that this weekend marks the official transition from summer into autumn. We've also finally settled into our new cottage. I feel like the first couple of weeks when you're moving house are just so chaotic. There are so many things in boxes and just so many like boring but quite important things to do, like obviously transferring all of your utilities and getting everything set up. So the first couple of weeks went by in a blur, but we're now fully settled, which means that I feel like this weekend is the perfect weekend to kickstart mission, make this cottage cozy for autumn, because obviously, as you can see, there are still some important jobs to be done, such as bringing my bookshelves back to life. I decided when we moved into this house that I wanted to give the bookshelves a bit of a refresh. I bought these bookshelves a couple of years ago when we moved into our house in York, and they have served me very, very well. But I was just kind of bored with having white bookshelves, I think because in rented houses, pretty much everything is white and grey or white and beige, which, you know, they're not bad colours, but they're also not exactly exciting either. So I figured that while we're still renting, I would try and inject a bit of colour into some of my own bits of furniture, hence the green refresh that I've given to these shelves. So now that they're finally painted and dried, they do need to be secured to the walls, but as soon as that's done, I can repopulate them with my books, and I think then this room will feel officially like it's mine. But aside from that, today we're planning to go for a bit of furniture shopping and just see if we can find a few little bits here and there to tie the place together, get some frames for a few bits of art that we want to pop up, and then I think we'll be feeling very cozy and very ready to enter into this new season, the best season if I do say so myself. Aside from that as well, obviously going into a new season, I'm thinking about the sort of books that I want to read. I am currently still in my reread of the A Song of Ice and Fire series, and I'm still partway through, I'm not partway through Game of Thrones, I'm partway through A Clash of Kings, which is the second book in the series. And I do feel like high fantasy in general does have a very autumn-winter feel, so I'm definitely going to be continuing on with that. But I have got a couple of new releases because September seems to be just jam-packed full of releases that I'm so excited about, and I don't tend to order brand new books that often, but this year there have just been a few that I couldn't say no to. One of which still hasn't been released yet, but Sally Rooney's new book, Intermezzo, is coming out I think next week, and I'm definitely excited to dive into that one. But the two that I've got, which I feel like definitely fit the autumn vibe, are Rewitched by Lucy Jane Wood, which is a debut which I've seen likened to a like cozy magical Gilmore Girls, but I think in a British setting. So I'm so excited about this. The cover is just so autumnal and I just think it looks so lovely. I believe it's about someone who is a witch but has kind of like left that part of her life behind, but then obviously becomes re-witched, and something in her life causes her to kind of like reconnect with the magical part of herself. I feel like it's going to be very uplifting and cozy and just perfect for this time of year. The next book I've got is Think Again by Jacqueline Wilson, which honestly is just, it brings me so much joy to say that I have a new Jacqueline Wilson book. I feel like a lot of the people who watch this channel are not based in the UK, and so this might not have such a significant meaning to you, but just to give a little bit of context, Jacqueline Wilson is a children's and sort of young adult author in the UK, and she has been writing for decades and decades and decades. She's kind of like a children's Stephen King in the sense of how many books she manages to churn out, and so many people like myself who grew up loving books can attribute that love of reading to Jacqueline Wilson because her books were just incredible. She touches on some quite like intense and dark and tricky subjects for young people, but just does them in such an incredible way, and she is just definitely the person that I attribute my love of reading for. And I have this distinct memory of reading a book called Clean Break by Jacqueline Wilson, and I think I was about 7 years old, and it was right around the time when you are in school and you finish reading all of the like prescribed books that you have to read to like move through the reading grades, and then you start to be able to do free reading and choose books for yourself, and that was one of the books that I chose for myself. and I reread it a million times. I think the hardback was literally hanging off my original copy because I'd read it so many times, and that just started a love of Jacqueline Wilson that stayed with me right throughout childhood. One of the books or series that she read was a series called Girls, and this was one of her like teen book series, and it focused on a group of girls called Ellie, Magda and Nadine, and there were 4 books in this series: Girls in Love, Girls Under Pressure, Girls Out Late and Girls in Tears. And it was just all about their life as teens with various different problems that occurred to them throughout. It touches on some topics like grooming and eating disorders, grieving a parent, and all sorts of other things like that. So it is, like I say, kind of hard hitting, but also just like the sort of book that I turned to so much when I was the age of the characters. And this book, think again, is Jacqueline Wilson's first adult book, and it is touching back in with Ellie, Magda and Nadine now that they are, I think, 40 years old. So all grown up, moved on, but still friends, and basically just seeing where they're at in their life since it happened. So I'm so excited about this. I'd say this is probably the most exciting book that's been released for me personally in a long time, because it is just so nostalgic and so exciting. So I cannot wait to dive into this one. But all that said, we've got some exciting books to read, but first things first, we need to go and do some shopping and try and get this house cozy, ready for some autumnal reading. Can we take a second just to appreciate these bookshelves, because they are finally locked and loaded and fully stocked with books again, which just feels so right. I feel like this room just felt very bare and unfinished without the books fully on the shelves, so to finally get them off the pile on the floor and back into their rightful place felt like such a lovely thing to take off the to-do list. And I thought I would give you a very brief tour of the books and how I've organised it, because I don't know about you guys, but I feel like there is always just this immense internal pressure to get it right when you move house, because the books suddenly are all off the shelf and there is just a world of possibilities available to you. And even though it's no different than just deciding to rearrange the shelves, I for one pretty much stick to how I start, and I just sort of add new books in wherever they belong. But it's only when I move house that I really take the time to think about the organisation. So it feels like a lot of pressure, but I'm pretty happy with how things have turned out. And I think we'll start with the shelf that I'm most excited about, and I should say shelves, because that is this top shelf, the next one, the one after that, and also part of the one below that, which belongs to our classics collection, which I feel like is definitely my most beautiful and prized collection of books, because there are just some absolutely gorgeous ones. And if I had to pick a favourite section, I think it would be right here across to the end of this shelf, which is my Jane Austen collection. I do think that Jane Austen is one of my favourite authors and probably my favourite classics author. I think her work is just incredible, and I have managed to collect some really gorgeous editions of her work, my favourites of which are the Wordsworth classics. I only have 2 of them, which are these books, Emma and Northanger Abbey, although I would love to collect all of the books in this series in the Wordsworth collection because they are just so beautiful. I think the artwork is just so delicate and simple but so gorgeous, and my favourite thing about these books is that on the back of them there is a little quote from the story. So on Northanger Abbey it says, "I have no notion of loving people by halves, it is not my nature," which is a very nice quote. And then for Emma we have, "You must be the best judge of your own happiness." I just think these are so beautiful, and I do have a couple of other Wordsworth classics, not Austen related, but I have Anne of Green Gables. The quote for this one is, "Life is worth living as long as there's a laugh in it," which I feel like is very Anne. And then I also have a very contrasting quote from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which just looks so gothic, and the quote says, "You must suffer me to go my own dark way," which I feel like is very fitting for this book. So absolutely love those Wordsworth classics and love my classic shelves in general. Now moving across, a new favourite shelf for me personally is this top one, which is my fantasy shelf. Now I haven't added a great deal of books to this recently, aside from the ACOTAR series and also the Fourth Wing books, but I just have this newfound love of fantasy, and so I definitely foresee that shelf growing as time goes on. I already have so many books that I want to buy, but it just feels nice to have these growing collections. And one of the best things about fantasy, I think, is that it's very rare that you end up with just one book. They often are part of series, and so you have these lovely collections of matching books, which I think is wonderful. Now moving down, we have what is predominantly a Stephen King shelf, but it also has a few other thrillers and horrors on there as well. We then have all of my hardbacks that don't fit into either the classic fantasy or thriller genres. So it's predominantly literary fiction, but partially some romances have found their way in there as well. Then beneath that we have basically the corresponding shelf, but for paperbacks, so it's just a mix of mostly literary fiction, but a few things like some dark academia, some historical fiction, and things like that, but it's basically just the paperbacks that don't fit into a really clear genre. And then beneath that we have the romance shelf. The only romances that are not on this shelf are some romances that I've siphoned across to the right and put into a Christmas romance shelf because I feel that deserves its very own category. And then over here to the left we have Jay's bookshelves, which is basically just all of his books that again don't fit into one of these categories that we've already assigned. So very happy with it. I'm just mostly happy to have the books on the shelves, but I'd love to know how you organise your shelves because I feel like there are so many different ways of doing it. I think for me, by genre makes the most sense, but there are always some anomalies that you just can't quite fit, and it is really tricky to just settle on something that you're happy with. But I'm happy and just happy to have fully stocked bookshelves again, which is just one of my favourite things. And now we've stocked the shelves, it's time to talk about one of the books that I started this weekend, or rather I should say the only book I started this weekend, because I didn't actually find time to get started on Rewitched, which in one sense I'm sad because I really did want to start that this weekend, but in another sense I do feel like I could do with putting that book off just a couple of weeks further, just to really let the autumnal vibe set in, because I feel like that book is just so autumnal that it would be nice to match the book to the season completely. So I started on Think Again by Jacqueline Wilson, and I'm now about halfway through this book. I'm on page 153 and I'm really enjoying it. I have seen this book marketed as a continuation of a series that you could treat as a standalone, and whilst I think in principle that is true, there isn't anything that happens in this book where you would be drawing a blank or unable to understand the plot if you hadn't read the original book series. I do think that I wouldn't recommend reading it as a standalone unless you were already a fan of Jacqueline Wilson and particularly the Girls series, because I really do feel like unless you'd read Ellie's original story you would probably find a lot of the nostalgic references to things that happened in the original series to just be a little bit pointless and maybe wouldn't like value them, whereas as a Jacqueline Wilson reader you can go into it and really like appreciate the nostalgia value of those references. So I would say you technically could read this book if you hadn't read the original series, but I'm not sure that I'd recommend it. Now I'm really enjoying this book, firstly for that nostalgia factor. I'm really loving returning back to these characters that I loved so much when I was younger, but I'm also just enjoying the fact that I think this book fits into a category of fiction I don't necessarily hear talked about all that often. What are you saying, Oscar? What's wrong? Anyone else have a cat that just cries and then you pick them up and they're absolutely fine because they just wanted your attention and it wasn't that they actually needed anything? But anyway, I feel like this book falls into this category of fiction which is kind of like people who are in their adulthood. They're no longer young adults, they are well established into adulthood, but they don't have everything figured out yet. And I feel like as a young person you expect that you reach a certain point in life and you will have just got everything figured out, know exactly what's going on and just be living this very stable life, whereas I think the reality for a lot of people is, this is a very large cat and a very difficult one to wrangle when I'm also trying to hold a book. What was I saying? Basically, I feel like that the reality for a lot of people is that you kind of do have life figured out. It's not as if anything is going disastrously wrong, but you never reach this point of suddenly everything is exactly as you expect adulthood to be like, and there is always like room for evolution and growth that I think as a child you don't really recognise that adults also go through such evolution and growth, and that you don't just suddenly reach like a fully formed version of yourself that stops changing. And actually we all change like right throughout life and have many different stages, and it's really interesting to see that sort of written about in fiction where there's nothing disastrous happening. These characters aren't going through some sort of like breakdown or major collapse in their life that requires rebuilding. They're just kind of muddling along and trying to work out like what they want to do, what direction they want to go in, and like what brings them joy. And I feel like it may be to some people mundane for that sort of thing to be written about in books, but to me, as someone who does enjoy just like contemporary literary fiction, I find the sorts of characters that are just living life and I guess like just figuring things out to be very relatable and quite comforting to read about. So I'm really enjoying that. And if you have any more books that fall into that category that you could recommend, I would love for you to share them. Another one that I have to recommend that falls into that category is Cat Lady by Dawn Porter, which feels very fitting given that I'm currently carrying this big cat around. But I really did love that book, and I felt like it can sort of fit into that same category of kind of like things aren't quite going right for the main character, but it's no major disaster, but it's just sort of figuring out what you want to do in your life. And I wouldn't quite call it a midlife crisis, but kind of like a midlife evolution is what these characters are going through. So in the case of the main character in this book, she became a mum when she was 20 years old, and now at the point of this book she's just turned 40 and her daughter has now left home to go off to university. So she's suddenly 40 and has just this whole world of opportunity available to her of freedom and no longer having to prioritise parenting as like the number one focus, but she suddenly just doesn't quite know what to do with all that freedom and is trying to work out like what direction to take life in. So that is Think Again, and I am really enjoying it. Another thing which I suppose is maybe a little bit on the sadder side about this book, which I again find quite relatable, is that one of the books from the original series, which was Girls Under Pressure, is all about Ellie, the main character, dealing with an eating disorder, which at the time when I read that as a teenager was very relatable then. And in this book, Ellie is obviously a 40-year-old woman and she has recovered from her eating disorder, but there is just this lingering negative self-talk and I guess like the sense that there is still a difficult relationship with her body image and with her relationship with food, which I feel like is so sad to read about, because you just would hope that recovery means not having those thoughts anymore, but the reality, of course, for a lot of people, whether you've had an eating disorder or just struggled with like yo-yo dieting or just in general feeling pressure to look a certain way, I think for a lot of people you may not have the negative behaviours associated with those thoughts anymore, but for so many of us there are just negative thoughts that surround body image, and it is just such a complex issue that, again, you might think, oh, that's a teenage issue, you grow out of it, but the reality is that you can take those thoughts and experiences into adulthood, and it's not as though adults just suddenly have everything figured out and no longer struggle with any of these issues. So again, kind of sad to see that that's part of the book, in the sense that it's sad in general that people deal with those issues, but so relatable that you wouldn't just have this character that struggled with all of these thoughts and issues as a teenager and now as an adult just doesn't even think about it, because I just don't think that's the case for a lot of people. But I am enjoying the book, hoping to read more later on. And another thing that I'm very excited about later on is that it is the first episode of the Great British Bake Off for 2024, which to me feels like the official start of autumn. I can't wait. First official week of autumn is serving tea weather, and I am so happy about it. Today's weather is extraordinarily gloomy, it is very grey, hasn't stopped raining all day, and that has just given me the perfect excuse to just keep on putting that kettle on even more than I normally would, and I for one am happy to take and hold on to that excuse with both hands. So right now I'm enjoying a very lovely cup of Earl Grey tea whilst it just pours down with rain outside. And I feel that not only has this given me the perfect excuse to drink tea on repeat instead of drinking any actual hydrating liquids, it's also given me the perfect setting to talk to you about a particularly controversial book to movie adaptation that I've seen talked about a lot this week, which I feel just fits this weather setting so perfectly. And that is a new book to movie adaptation that has been announced for Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, obviously a gothic classic. Before we dive into this discussion, I feel it's only right to give a moment of glory to this beautiful cover, which is a Penguin Deluxe classic, and I just think it is just so interesting. It kind of gives maybe like Coraline vibes, or definitely some sort of like Tim Burton-esque vibe, and it just captures the gothic style of the book so incredibly well, but also is quite a fun sort of take on it. But all that to say, this week there have been some casting announcements made in regards to this new Wuthering Heights adaptation, and specifically it's been announced that the two main characters, Cathy and Heathcliff, are going to be played by Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi. And let's just say the reception to that announcement has been lukewarm at best. I feel like the book-loving community, specifically people who of course love the Brontes and Wuthering Heights, have been outraged by this announcement, because it's just felt that there are so many multitudes of reasons that that is just not the right casting decision. And so I thought that it would be fun to talk about and see what you guys think. I for one don't think it's a very good casting. One reason being, of course, the age of the characters versus the age of those actors, but another thing being just something completely sort of very difficult to describe, but just an air about people. And the reason that I've sort of struggled to describe it, and I've seen it described on social media as iPhone face, but I feel like some people just have modern faces and other people have more timeless faces, and there's nothing sort of good or bad about either of those things, but it does kind of, I guess, limit the role that someone could play believably. And I just feel like I could never see Margot Robbie and believe that she is in like the 1800s. It just doesn't seem very believable to me, and having seen someone like Jacob Elordi in things like Euphoria, I just feel like he has a very modern vibe to him, which isn't a bad thing whatsoever, but it also just means that it would be really difficult to fully envision them as these characters. I also feel like they both feel very commercial, and obviously the characters in this book are a little bit, I guess, more dark and twisted and rugged, and there is just a lot more depth as opposed to like shiny Hollywood beauty, which I feel like is kind of what those actors exude, and so it's really hard to envision them in this role. And then yeah, the age is just on top of that, but I feel you could definitely overlook age. So many actors have played characters that are way out of their age range, and if they capture the role really well, then you can kind of overlook that, but if not, it just adds an extra thing that means that they just don't feel quite right for it. So I just don't think that they are the right pick for the role. I feel like they just seem too modern, too shiny, too Hollywood. And also another thing that I think is worth mentioning is that there are some actors who are so successful and so popular that they start cropping up in everything, and instead of seeing the character that they're supposed to be playing, you just see the actor that they are. And I feel like Margot Robbie specifically has just become so popular in recent years that she is Margot Robbie, and I feel like it would be hard to look past that and see the character that she's playing, especially in like a period drama like this would be. So very, very mixed emotions, let's say, because it's just like such a great opportunity to bring it to life again. And I think there have been some incredible recent adaptations of classics that have been done again, like the Little Women adaptation by Greta Gerwig, or I can't remember who was the director of the 2020 version of Emma, which starred Anya Taylor-Joy, and it also had, was it Mia Goth in it? That was just so incredible. So I don't think it's a case of it being overdone, but just that I don't think it's being done right with this casting. But I have seen some really interesting suggestions and fan casting ideas that people have come up with, and I think the one that I loved the most was Luke Pasqualino as Heathcliff and Thomasin McKenzie as Kathy, and I just immediately felt like they would be so good for the role. And I think Thomasin McKenzie specifically has exactly what I was talking about, where she has such a period drama face, where I think you could put her in any era and you would immediately believe that she was supposed to be there. She was in a TV show which I can't remember what it was called now, but it was basically where like her life, she kept dying and then her life would start again from scratch, and it was started I think in like the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s, and it went right through to, yeah, it must have been early 1900s because it definitely got to World War II at some point. But she was just incredible, and that obviously went through quite a few different decades and eras, and she was just amazing. She was also in Jojo Rabbit, which is set around World War II again, so I think she is just so good for period dramas, and I think she would be amazing. But another casting that I've seen is Dev Patel as Heathcliff and Emily Carey, who was in House of the Dragon, as Kathy, and again I think that would be incredible. I just think there is such an opportunity to make this a really good adaptation, but a lot of it rides on the casting, because obviously although there are so many different layers to making a film good, obviously in this case the story is kind of already there, and so the characters are like the next most important thing to bring that story to life. And of course when there are such vivid descriptions of how characters look and act in their ages, it's quite difficult to just kind of throw that all away and cast people that completely don't match, but it does seem that that is the case in this particular adaptation. So I guess we'll see what happens, but for now myself and plenty of other people are not feeling so hot about this one, because it just seems like it's going to miss the mark, which is such a shame. But moving back on to the present day, because of course I don't actually know when that Wuthering Heights adaptation is going to be coming out. I have been making the most of this autumnal weather and have managed to fly through the last half of Think Again, which I just finished yesterday evening, and I really did enjoy this one. I stand by my earlier statement. I think my enjoyment of this book definitely hinged on the nostalgia that I felt for the characters and the writer and her writing style, and I just think all of those factors combined made this such a lovely read for me. And it almost felt as though, like, Jacqueline Wilson's writing style felt very much the same as it did when I was reading the books that she wrote when I was younger, and so it just felt like a continuation, like I'd picked right back up and dropped myself into like my childhood reading experience, but of course with characters that are older and having slightly different experiences. But on the whole, I think it was really fun, an easy read, and above all else very nostalgic. There were a couple of critiques I had of this book, largely around the fact that it felt like the ending was quite abrupt. I was really happy with the ending, and I feel like it went in a direction that was just really nice and uplifting, and I felt like the main character needed that uplifting ending. But it felt as though like this massive life shift occurred, and then the book just ended, and there was no picking up with her and her best friends and like sort of filling them in with this big change in her life, which feels like something that the character would have done. So it almost felt as though we were just robbed of a couple of chapters to kind of conclude the narrative a little bit better. And on the subject of the best friends, obviously the book predominantly focused on Ellie, but we were kind of promised to touch base back in with Nadine and Magda, her two best friends that also featured in the original series, and we got some like quite big revelations about their life, but it felt as though it kind of just like dropped off at one point and we never got to see the conclusion of their stories, which, you know, may just be the fact that they're not the main character, but it would have been nice kind of knowing that it's unlikely, never say never, but I would imagine unlikely that we're going to get any continuation from this series in the form of another adult novel, because that's just not typically what Jacqueline Wilson has ever done. This is a bit of a one of a kind in that respect. So knowing that we may never get another follow-up to these characters, I think it would have been nice to kind of like tie things up a little bit more neatly and give some resolution to all of the characters that we had been introduced to or reconnected with. But on the whole, I really did enjoy this one, and I'm so glad that she decided to write an adult continuation specifically of this series, because I think if I'm to look back and think about the impact of Jacqueline Wilson's books, the Girls series is one that I just turned to and read and reread so many times that it was just really, really lovely to see that picked up and to get to sort of interact with those characters again, but in their adult forms. So really enjoyed, and it was such a lovely nostalgic entrance into autumnal reading. Now I am of course planning to get started on Rewitched as my next read, but I think I'll save that for the weekend and get started on another cosy book to enter into the weekend. And next weekend I'm also planning to go to a yarn festival. You might have seen while I was watching Bake Off, but I've very, very, very recently picked up knitting and I am loving it so much. So I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in the next one. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed, and I hope that your first official week of autumn has been as lovely and cosy as mine. And if you've picked up any particularly cosy autumnal books, let me know what you're reading in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.